Hello, this is Dr. Michelle Devlin with the University of Northern Iowa. Welcome to this training on working with the Marshallese, a group of environmental migrants that are living now in Iowa as well as other states within America. This presentation was produced again by myself. I'm a professor at the University of Northern Iowa and the chair of the Division of Health Promotion and Education. I'm a professor of global health, and then it was also produced by my colleague, Dr. Mark Gray, professor of applied anthropology at the University of Northern Iowa as well. So we wanted to start off by giving you an overview of who the Marshallese are within the United States, who this population is, and how they wound up coming to Iowa. So the Marshall Islands, they are actually a group of coral atolls, and they are an independent country, an independent island nation in the northwestern Pacific. They, in fact, if you fly, if you're in Hawaii, they are roughly about 5 hours west of Hawaii by airplane. They are that far west. They're actually, the country is pretty close to the Philippines, to Guam. It's north of Australia and that part of the world. There are 5 larger islands and almost 30 coral reef atolls that make up the country of the Marshall Islands. Roughly the size of Washington, D.C. They've got a little over 70,000 residents of Micronesian ethnicity, and their capital is Majuro. And here is a map of Oceania, basically all the different island nations that exist in the Pacific. And you can see there are hundreds and hundreds of different islands of different sizes scattered throughout the Pacific Ocean. The Marshall Islands are roughly in the middle of the map there, right in the middle and in the upper quadrant and the middle of the map. You'll see the Marshall Islands there. They are just northeast of the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau is west of the Federated States of Micronesia. So that area of the world is called Micronesia, which means thousands of little islands. Marshall Islands actually are very famous within Oceania because this is the part of the Pacific region that, frankly, the Americans in the United States, the American military tested nuclear weapons. After World War II and during the Cold Era, we had actually 67 hydrogen bombs tested out in that part of the world. Very famous photographs, of course, of nuclear explosions over places like the famous Bikini Atoll. And this part of the world used to be occupied by Japan during part of World War II, and we fought the Japanese there in the United States, and ultimately the Marshall Islands became a territory of the U.S. During that time. And again, this is an area where we tested nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, by 1956, it became the most polluted part of the Earth because of all the fallout from the radiation and nuclear testing. The Americans actually physically had to relocate a number of Marshallese from some of these atoll islands because of all of that nuclear testing. And even today, we do see the aftermath and health concerns of some of the residents because of the presence of radioactive waste that remains in some parts of the Pacific where the Marshall Islands are. In 1979, the Marshall Islands became an independent country. They gained independence from the United States and were no longer a territory of the U.S. Here you can see a colorized version, some of the famous photographs of the testing of American nuclear weapons out there in the Pacific and on these tiny sandy coral atoll islands back after World War II. As part of an agreement with the Marshall Islands for the nuclear damage that was caused to their country, the Marshallese and the Americans entered into what is called the Compact of Free Association in 1983. And so the Marshallese, as well as people from the Federated States of Micronesia and Palau, were granted the ability to come to the United States for a limited amount of years, and they were allowed to come to the U.S. legally for work and travel and for study. And so when the Marshallese come to the United States, they do not need any special visas or green cards. They are fully entitled to work and live and study wherever they would like in the United States, and they can stay as long as they want. The challenge with the Marshall Islands now is that they are on the front end of climate change and global warming and the submersion of island nations under seawater. Currently within the Marshall Islands, because they are such small sandy atolls, actually the highest point on most of those islands within the Marshalls can be typically no more than 9 feet high, about 3 meters, roughly 9 to 10 feet high above sea level. A lot of the atolls, a lot of these coral-based islands, these atolls are no more than half a mile wide, 1 mile wide in some of their widest areas. So they're very, very thin and narrow strips of land out in the middle of the Pacific. Well, now that we have rapidly rising sea levels due to the melting of the polar ice caps due to global warming and climate change, we are seeing these atolls and these islands in large parts of the Pacific under increasing and very dangerous environmental threat. They are submerging under ocean water. There are more frequent storms, more common hurricanes and typhoons, stronger winds than ever before, and more frequent storms. And we are seeing the utter devastation of large parts of these kinds of atolls that are around the Pacific. And the Marshall Islands are among the First Nations that are believed to be going underwater and going under ocean water within roughly the next decade or so. And what's going to happen, what's being predicted to happen to the Marshalls as well as certain other coral atoll island nations in the Pacific, is that they will actually not drown under seawater first. They will actually die of thirst, as it's said, because their drinking water is becoming damaged by blowing ocean water, heavy rising sea levels. Their agricultural areas are becoming destroyed. Many of these atolls, you can no longer plant on them, and grow crops. You can't drink the water in some of these areas. Their soil quality is deteriorating. Their sewage systems are collapsing. Cemeteries are collapsing. Infrastructure is falling apart. And homes are being increasingly exposed to very dangerous surf, rising waters, and strong storms. So essentially, countries like the Marshall Islands are very much affected by global rising seas, climate change, and this new pattern of natural destruction with the environment. And here you Mark and I just returned recently from the Marshall Islands, where we were working on a research project there related to the migration of the Marshallese from the Pacific to Iowa. And you can see as you approach by airplane, this is functionally what the Marshall Islands look like. Again, they're very narrow strips of coral atolls, some vegetation on them. You can see the shallow coral reefs and then the open ocean beyond the surf line. Here's another view of some of these atolls, and you can see how the humans are increasingly living in more and more densely packed areas because large parts of their islands are totally submerged under ocean water at this point. And increasingly, again, they do not have enough fresh drinking water or healthy soil where they can plant crops and grow food. Because of that, the Marshallese, as well as other certain populations in the Pacific, are increasingly being referred to, in the popular press anyway, as climate change refugees. The International Organization on Migration refers to them probably more correctly as environmental migrants. So people from the Marshall Islands have essentially been affected multiple times by severe environmental damage in their part of the world. First, during the testing of nuclear weapons there by the Americans after World War II, during the Cold War against the Soviets, when we were worried about nuclear global devastation. They tend to have a very poor economy anyway, and now with the rising seas and the global warming has created, and the more collapse of their economy now has created greater migration from their country into other parts of the world. And the Marshallese have been coming to the United States for a number of years. In fact, we've had Marshallese in Iowa for at least the past 10 years, if not longer, in some communities. Right now, about a third of the Marshallese have already left the islands and moved to the United States or other countries in order to seek out a stronger economy and to avoid the literally radioactive fallout, waste, and the destruction by the climate of their economy. Right now, there are roughly 23,000 or so Marshallese in the U.S. as of 2010. Hawaii was the primary state for their resettlement, but you will find significant populations of the Marshallese in states like Arkansas, as well as Washington, Southern California, and even in Iowa, where we are believed to have several thousand of them. And in Iowa, they are coming specifically because they're being recruited by a number of companies, especially in the meatpacking and agricultural processing industry, to work as meatpackers. And this gets tricky in terms of what to call this population. Again, the popular press tends to use the word climate change refugees, but in all honesty, the term refugee is a legal status designation by the United Nations and resettlement countries, and is not typically applied to this population. They are not entitled to the same benefits, legal benefits, that refugees typically are when they flee their homes, primarily because the persecution, political persecution, is not really the cause of their movement. So because of that, the term that's probably more correct to use, frankly, is environmental migrants. And as you can see from this slide, the definition essentially refers to groups of people that either due to sudden or progressive change in their environment are having adverse effects on their lives and their living conditions, and therefore they are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently, and to move either within their countries or abroad. And just as a case in point, about 10% of the world's population lives within 9 to 10 feet above sea level and primarily along bodies of water, and these populations are disproportionately poor. We see environmental migrants now all over the world due to climate change and more frequent storms and greater severity of natural disasters. And so you will see environmental migrants, for instance, in countries now ranging anywhere from the Pacific and the Marshalls to Vietnam, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Bangladesh, and South Asia. Even within the United States, you can think of populations that live along the lower Mississippi Delta, lower regions of Louisiana, parts of Washington, D.C., New York. Okay, all of these places now in the world have areas of concern where they have frequent flooding, rising seawaters, rising floodwaters and river waters that make living there more and more precarious and dangerous, and resulting in migration and human movement. Here are a few photographs for you to be thinking about what the situation looks like back in the Marshall Islands. This is the capital, Majuro, and the small international airport there. You can see some of the Marshallese women walking out to the airplane to leave the island. This is the actual runway, or the tarmac, of the airport in Majuro, and that is ocean water on the tarmac of the airport. It regularly blows over right onto the tarmac, and you'll see sandbags and other such things to try to keep parts of the airport dry, especially in heavy rain and heavy trade wind storms. This is a causeway, a walkway outside of the shantytown, frankly, of Ebi in the Marshall Islands. And you can see how very, very narrow it is. And that is ocean water, again, that is sitting on the gravel road. And you can see the ocean, the open ocean and the lagoon on both sides of that causeway, and how very narrow it is and susceptible to rising seas and violent storms. This is the community of Ebi, which is right outside of the U.S. Army base at Kwajalein and the island of Kwajalein and the Marshall Islands. A number of very important military battles were fought in this part of the world during World War II between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy. But you can see these homes now are very much right at the end of the land and right where the ocean is increasingly moving up closer and closer to their homes. And that's during calm weather. You can imagine how much damage these homes receive from heavy winds and heavy rainstorms. Again, another home right at the edge of Ebi here, right at the edge of this particular atoll with the open ocean right in front of it and the broken seawalls that used to be there to protect the homes. But the seawalls in Ebi are regularly broken about once a year and are simply impossible to keep up with to rebuild them to protect the community. Here, a young child looking into the water, the lagoon here in Ebi. Due to the rising temperatures in the ocean water, the fish are not as abundant as they used to be. The coral reefs are dying. Sea turtles are not necessarily as common as they used to be, and other sources of ocean food for the community. And so you'll see lots of imported food now because the people cannot plant or grow their own crops and can really not effectively support themselves anymore in terms of food from the ocean that used to be so rich in fish and other animal life for the people. Here you can see a permanent seawall has been replaced by inexpensive corrugated tin as a temporary way to keep out wind and rain from houses. But of course, that corrugated tin falls apart very quickly in strong storms in the Marshalls. These are several gentlemen that live in the community of Ebi in the Marshall Islands. They do not have adequate drinking water on the island. The water is brackish and salty, and so they tend to use the water that is there only for washing or showering. And in order to get really clean drinking water, they take a ferry across the lagoon for about 15-20 minutes to the American Army base of Kwajalein, and they fill up on fresh water on Kwajalein because there is still fresh water there. And then they put it in jugs and take it home to their families in Ebi so they have clean water to drink. So you can see already here how the climate change has affected their water supply. A lot of the homes in the shantytown in Ebi will have large tubs or large plastic containers put in by different aid agencies in the hope of catching rainwater that can be used also for drinking and other purposes on the island. This is one of the, frankly, virtually probably the only significant garden in the community of Ebi, on the island of Ebi in the Marshall Islands, because people cannot grow food anymore. The water waves come over the island, the atoll, it's too salty, the soil is destroyed and has high levels of salt in it, and so it's difficult for them to grow crops and to grow food. And you can see the netting that has been put above this demonstration garden. This is actually a garden that is supported by the local hospital on a diabetes education project, and they've had to provide a great deal of effort to keep it going and screens to keep out salt water so the plants and the crops will not die. A part of the problem, too, with rising seawaters when you live on a very small island and one that's not very tall is that you have a lot of waste that you have to get rid of. So toxic waste and human waste and city dumps are increasingly becoming covered with ocean water. And so you can imagine the toxins and environmental hazards and chemicals that leach out of such things into the water, into the soil, into drinking water and other sources. This is a typical street again in the community of Ebi, and that is ocean water that is covering part of that street there after a recent storm. And here we have young children on the island of Ebi. And you see how close the homes are now to the ocean itself, to the rising waters, those rising waters coming up and leaching out chemicals and other dangers from lots of things that are just left and scattered there, and metal and other hazards. So, in terms of socio-cultural considerations and what to be aware of when you're working with the Marshallese in Iowa, I wanted to provide you with some basic information about this. So, in terms of Iowa, we have a large population now of Marshallese that live in this state. We are increasingly becoming a major resettlement for Marshallese. They are often coming into other states like Oklahoma or like Arkansas. They're working in meatpacking communities, and then they are moving into Iowa to join other family members who are also working for meatpacking companies as well. So they often change states and change locations as secondary migrants. In Iowa, we have some significant populations of the Marshallese right here in the Waterloo area, as well as Dubuque, some in Cedar Rapids, even some in Des Moines. But you will see them around the state, typically concentrated in Marshallese or Micronesian communities. They often will work, as I mentioned, agricultural processing jobs, ice making, warehousing, and other such occupations where, frankly, a lot of English language is not required and you don't have to have a high skill level. They can train you on the job with what to do. Again, the families will typically self-recruit each other from other states in the U.S. to come join them. And if you have a population of Marshallese in your community, it's likely, although not absolutely guaranteed, that you will also have other Pacific Islanders there as well, typically from places like Guam, U.S. territory, or places like Palau that and the Federated States of Micronesia, because they can also come to the U.S. through the Compact of Free Association. So those populations are, by and large, in Iowa and in the United States legally as workers. Here you can see some of the children from Ebi and from the Marshall Islands. You'll certainly be encountering a lot of children here with the Marshallese in Iowa because of their population pyramid and high numbers of children. Language, literacy, and education issues. The Marshallese typically speak Marshallese, but it could be the Raytac dialect, the Raylick dialect. Some of them will also speak English, or what we call Pidgin English, sort of a Pacific Island English. Some of them may have very low levels of literacy, even in Marshallese, especially if they are older or have not had very many years of school. This population, as of now, typically does not pursue advanced degrees, post-secondary degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, things like that, because a number of them, perhaps as many as half, still have not finished high school. So you may be in a community in Iowa where it's important for them to have access to be able to finish their high school degree, even though they're over 18 years old. And so community colleges in Iowa are playing an important role in helping to educate the Marshallese. In terms of their family patterns, the Marshallese tend to live in large extended families, higher fertility rates, big households. You will often see multiple families sharing the same house. When I was in the Marshall Islands, it was not unusual at all to have 20 or more people sharing a single home because you had multiple families living together. They tend to identify their matrilineal groups, so they identify by clan and family and historic land patterns back home. Women tend to be very powerful in this culture, and they hold a very influential role in the society. Children are very, very much loved and adored and valued, and older people are viewed as elders, people of wisdom and knowledge that should be honored. And you will see these populations typically be pretty mobile, pretty migrant. It's not unusual to have cousins leaving home and, moving to live with other aunts, uncles, relatives, because again, they do not identify by tiny nuclear families as would be typical among the large white population in Iowa, but they identify by clan and large extended families. So it's very, very common to see them changing homes and being quite fluid in terms of, who they live with. Here again, we have some Marshallese children back in Ebi and playing basketball there and different sports. Cultural communication styles, they're generally considered to be a saving face culture. In other words, honor is very important to them, and avoiding shame or embarrassment and bringing dishonor and embarrassment upon the family. So, for instance, you may be working with them and you may be asking them questions, and they could perhaps tell you yes, 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 because to say no might be embarrassing for their family. So you've got to really know these families well and know what's happening with them. They typically value warmth and hospitality. They're very laid back culture. Typically, they value a relaxed communication style, lots of family interaction. Most of their time will be spent with each other in close family relationships. Verbally, they can be more reserved until you know them better, until they know you, but nonetheless quite warm and quite welcoming. It's much more likely also that they're going to avoid direct, open verbal conflict and anger, expressions of anger directly with people or with you and your agency. It would be much more likely, if they're upset, that they just won't come back anymore for your services, or be upset in nonverbal ways. It can also be quite common that they will not look you directly in the eye. That's typically viewed as being too intimate and too aggressive. So out of respect and honor for you, especially if you are working in an agency, you're a health person or a policewoman or, doctor, whatever, they often will keep their eyes down when they speak with you and speak quietly as a way to honor and respect you. And most Iowans working with the Marshallese are going to be considered people of honor as well, because you might be a teacher, a doctor, again, a police officer, and those are positions that are held in high esteem within the culture. Here again, you can actually see a local Marshallese man at a church at the driveway, the parking lot, entering a church in the Marshall Islands, and that is the ocean, open lagoon, right there, right up against the parking lot of the church. You can see how much the water has increasingly moved up and is starting to cover up the island. So employment patterns for the Marshallese within Iowa, you will typically see them living in groups, as I mentioned, and living near anchor companies. For instance, in Waterloo, a lot of the Marshallese folks here work with the local meatpacking industry. In Dubuque, you will often see them congregated around ice production facilities, but it depends where you're going to be and what community. Again, often the jobs that they're working in do not require high levels of English or high levels of education or literacy, and those tend to be the major employers for the Marshallese as of now. These folks, as I mentioned before, are here legally because of the Compact of Free Association that the United States has with the Marshallese. So they can work wherever they want, they can study where they want, they can live and travel wherever they want, and do not need special permission to do so. However, because of the kinds of jobs they do, they definitely are often working in occupations that can have high risks of injuries and illnesses. If you think of agricultural processing jobs, for instance, the long days, cutting up meat, packaging, processed foods, and occupational injuries and risks that are associated with those types of activities. In terms of health insurance and insurance benefits, according to a study done in the Dubuque population, only roughly half, around that figure, may actually have some type of insurance benefits from jobs in Iowa. This, by the way, is a photograph back home from the Kwajalein Atoll, the Kwajalein Island, where the U.S. military has had a long-standing presence since World War II. And a lot of the Marshallese actually that live in the community of Ebi travel the ferry daily back home and work with the American military there in Kwajalein. In terms of faith and religion topics, you'll see that the Marshallese in Iowa were very much affected by missionary work back home in the Marshall Islands. So you'll see a strong connection between missionaries and the Marshallese, and then the churches they form here in Iowa. So overwhelmingly Christian, and of the Christian groups, heavily different Protestant organizations, Assembly of God, for instance, there's a large Assembly of God church here in Waterloo, Dubuque. You'll see Marshallese Mormons, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, even Ahmadiyya Muslims on occasion within the U.S. for the Marshallese, Baha'i, and others. And faith and religion is very important to most Marshallese and Marshallese families. And in fact, if you're looking to make connections with their community and do outreach and education, one of the best and fastest ways to do that is to reach out to their churches and their religious organizations. Speak with their pastors, their ministers, their religious leaders, and it's often the best way to have an early entree into their community. This is actually a large Assembly of God church back in the community of Ebi in the Marshall Islands. Again, you can see, you look at that church and look at that ocean and how close they are to each other. And this is actually Dubuque Paradise Church here in eastern Iowa. So another place, again, just think about partnering with faith institutions, faith groups, and community associations and ethnic associations when you want to try to reach out to the Marshallese here in the state. In terms of public health and medical considerations of the Marshallese, in Iowa, their primary health concerns are going to be chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases that are showing up at young ages. Certainly diabetes is very significant and at relatively younger ages. Advanced stage cancer, it is not unusual to find families that have cancer, advanced stage cancer. Certainly there are still issues of thyroid cancer and other conditions that are a result of some of the radioactive waste that can still be found in certain parts of the Marshall Islands. Overweight, obesity can be quite common among this population, especially because of the significant change in their traditional diet. Dental caries, of course, due to the higher consumption of Coca-Cola and starchy foods and processed foods. From a mental health standpoint, they will typically not talk about this, but it can be a challenge, and because of the stigma, but things like depression, anxiety, acculturation, stress, and cultural bereavement. As I mentioned before, occupational injuries can certainly be present because of the types of jobs that they do. We also see some infectious diseases among this population, so things like tuberculosis. Back home, back in the Marshalls, they actually still have a certain form of leprosy, even that you will see present amongst some of the Marshallese back home. And then because of the large number of children, maternal and child health issues and breastfeeding and prenatal care and postnatal care and pregnancy care and all of that, any of those topics will be a priority for this population. In terms of barriers, although roughly half or more may actually have health insurance in Iowa, they often do not have money to pay the deductibles or the co-pays or other cash needs associated with medical insurance. They'll often assume that medical insurance means they have free care everywhere, and so education needs to be done that, well, you actually still need co-pays and deductibles even with insurance. You can also run into transportation barriers to medical care, literacy issues, cross-cultural barriers, and language issues as well with this population when doing health programming. Although they can legally work here, most of the Marshallese typically are not eligible for federal programs. That is not part of the Compact of Free Association. And so you will often find that even though they work in American jobs, they typically are not paying into things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, because of their unique migration status, unless other arrangements have been made or things like that. Many of them will use traditional Asian Pacific Islander modalities, health and treatment modalities. You'll see the use of herbal remedies. And it's actually very sad because back home, they are losing their traditional health practices because a lot of the plants and herbs and healing, again, healing remedies and healing plants simply can't grow anymore in some of these islands because they become too salty with the rising seas. And so they have to go to other islands to pick traditional plants and make remedies, or sometimes they will get them from other locations and mail them back and forth to each other between the U.S. and the Marshalls. This actually is the Kitlan Memorial Health Center. It's a large health center in the middle of the community of Ebi in the Marshall Islands. And it is, ironically, it is not unheard of to have the Marshallese come back to the Marshall Islands from America sometimes to get medical care that they simply cannot afford in the United States. We did hear of cases of people, for instance, with serious dental problems leaving America and coming back to the Marshalls and getting care in the Marshalls for some of those conditions. Here are some photographs too that I think really drive home why non-communicable diseases and conditions like diabetes and overweight and obesity and dental caries are so prevalent among the Marshallese. Their economies have collapsed. Again, they cannot plant by and large or eat a lot of their traditional foods. They're living in more densely packed communities because the islands are submerging. It's hard to exercise, to move naturally like they used to, and they have to import virtually all of their food at this point. So you see a lot of the starchy, cheap, packaged and processed simple carbohydrates and snack foods and junk foods and filling foods are very common in a lot of the stores in the Marshall Islands, as well as in some of the Pacific Islander stores, even in Iowa. This is the very small produce section in one small store we were in Ebi, in the Marshall Islands. Again, this is a tropical part of the world. You would expect to see large, numbers of, pineapples and mango and guava and different kinds of things, taro root and things like that. But very, very small, limited selection of these types of produce items, and even they have to be imported. They can no longer be grown there. Again, it wouldn't be the Pacific without Spam and canned meat. It's very common among this culture to eat meats like this. And so, the combination between the carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, and the processed meats in cans, a very, very common dietary patterns of Spam and the corned beef. You even see the canned fish. And again, it's very sad, dying way of life due to the destruction of the natural environment to plant your own crops, as well as the rising seas and the warmer ocean temperatures from climate change that is killing off the fish, the coral reefs, and driving away the natural ocean sources of food for this population. These are three delightful women we met in the Iowa city of Dubuque. They are helping run and work in a model Marshall Island Community Health Outreach Program through the Crescent Community Health Center. They're doing terrific work. And so we are seeing model programs like this now starting to take place in Iowa because of the significant number of Marshallese here in the state. So to finish up with just some general recommendations and resources for you to think about. Primarily when you work with the Marshallese, we definitely would recommend face-to-face communication, especially group programming. They can often help even translate or interpret for each other. And this can be a very effective way to work with them rather than relying on written material or internet websites or things like that, unless their literacy rates are higher. Definitely work with this population as partners and target their different community leaders or faith leaders, family leaders as your partners in programming, whether that be in the public health field, the social service field, the policing, public safety field, and others. These, again, it's a group-based culture. Large numbers of people living within clans and matrilineal clans, in other words, derived from the mother's line, and allowing time for group decision making and consensus in this community will be very important. Because of the large number of Marshallese that already are within the United States in a handful of states like Arkansas, Oklahoma, again, Washington, Hawaii, and California, you can turn to these states and their Marshallese communities for resources. There are Marshallese clinics and public safety programs and social service projects operating in key areas within the United States. Literally, if you just Google it, those sources of information will come up for you. You can contact them. They often will share ideas and advice and resources and materials with you. Do not recreate anything. You don't have to do that. It's already been done. This population also does very well if you provide outreach and education and prevention programs on site where they live, where they work, play, shop, worship, recreate. You typically will be providing services to them on site. So target different holidays, sports events, and again, faith services where you can work, for instance, with local ministers to come in after a faith service, for instance, after a religious service perhaps, and do a talk or do a program or an educational service for the community. They will respond best ultimately through long-term, trusting, genuine, warm, face-to-face relationships with key members of your agency staff that hopefully you can keep in place to be your main points of contact with the population. And in terms of resources for you, again, we do have a number of organizations with Iowa that are really pioneering work with this population. The Dubuque Community School District and their English Language Learners and Interpreters Program done a lot of work with the Marshallese. The University of Dubuque Nursing Program has specialists with this population. They've done research with them as well. Again, the Dubuque Marshall Island Health Project, I showed you the photograph of some of our colleagues there doing terrific outreach work with this population. There are lots of Marshallese churches in Iowa. Again, I use the example of Healing Waters here in Waterloo. Great partners, very interested in collaborating with local Iowan agencies to assist the well-being of their families. In Des Moines, the Iowa Commission on the Status of Asian Pacific Islanders has a lot of information and good ideas on how to work with the Marshallese as well as other API populations in the state. The Iowa International Center in Des Moines, if you Google it, they do offer free emergency interpretation if you are working with the Marshallese or other immigrant and refugee groups and you need an emergency interpreter. There is an 800 number there that you can use. If you go to their website, you'll get more information about that. Arkansas has a very, very large population of Marshallese that have been there for many years. You can access a whole profile of the Marshallese community there through the Rockefeller Foundation. Again, if you Google it, lots of really good information. And remember that the Marshallese are one of a number of different populations now in the world that are designated as environmental migrants, or again, what the popular press refers to as climate change refugees. If you Google that term and those phrases, you'll find a lot of information out there from global organizations like the United Nations on climate change and environmental migration and what happens to these populations in their home countries and what's happening to them when they resettle. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your interest in learning more about this very important Asian Pacific Islander group that we have within Iowa. And again, I'm Dr. Michelle Devlin, my colleague Dr. Mark Gray. Please feel free to telephone us or email us for more information and more assistance when you're working with the Marshallese as well as populations from the Federated States of Micronesia and or Palau here in the state of Iowa. Thank you very much.